Fraction Prime sold everything, even hope. Its bazaar stretched under a canopy of oxidized latticework and flickering ads, a mile of stalls where grease and incense couldn't quite hide the smell of old metal and older mistakes. Traders barked in a dozen tongues, biolights swung from cables like lowered moons. In one dim corridor, where the gutter runoff turned to ice, something small and gray lay curled in a dented enclosure between a rusted cargo exosuit and a crate of cracked star charts. It was a dragon by architecture, if not by size, dwarfed by age, wings torn to ribbons of membrane, scales dulled to the color of ash after rain. When it breathed, the sound was a hinge that needed oil. Children darted close to point and make daring faces, then scuttled away when a weary eyelid slid open and a pupil the color of winter sky narrowed to a slit. A trader in a stained coat flicked his chin toward it whenever a buyer slowed, recited a price as if spitting out gristle, and rolled his eyes when the buyer moved on. "Too old," he told a purple-skinned emissary whose robes cost more than the stall had earned in a week. "Teeth gone, flight gone, fire gone. What remains? Sentiment? Sentiment does not pay docking fees." The emissary peered at the collar around the creature's neck. A band of some old alloy that had outlasted several owners, green with patina at the edges. A tag hung from it on a bent loop. The emissary squinted at the engraving, failed to resolve it into any of Vraxian's scripts, and shook their head. "Useless," they murmured, and swept away in a tone that made useless sound expensive. The dragon did not protest the slander with a growl. It lowered its head to its forepaws, nostrils fogging the metal floor, and let the market pass around it. When the auctioneer came and banged a rod on a crate to stir interest, even the sound seemed to give the little beast a wide berth. The bidding began high for form's sake, then fell through silence toward charity. No one raised a hand. The crowd parted because of a wrench, of all things. A battered thing tucked into a utility belt on a man whose boots announced that walking was one of his few luxuries. He wore the planet's dust like a second skin and the sleep of too many night shifts under his eyes. He paused at the cage, and in the pause, the bazaar forgot to jeer. He leaned in, not to appraise muscle or talon, but to examine the tag no one else could read. With a thumb already carrying a lifetime of grease, he rubbed away the crust of neglect until letters glinted through. Property of Earth's first expedition, Unit Guardian 7. The words steadied the air around him. Those close enough to hear breathed them with him as sound without meaning. He breathed them as memory braided with story, ghost briefings in old classrooms, the romance of names carved into hulls that never came home. The rumor that Earth once sent guardians ahead of its children, the way a parent feels for the light switch in the dark before they carry a sleeping kid into a room. He looked at the dragon. A seam opened in his face that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with recognition. "Guardian," he said, quietly enough that only the creature and a few curious wires could hear. "You're one of ours." The merchant sensed leverage and leaned on it with both elbows. "Human, you want the relic? It eats and leaks and dies. It frightens the decorum of paying clients. Take it, but take it dear." The human, Kieran Holt, who had signed his name 100 times on repair manifests and once on a letter that never reached anyone, unclipped his license chip and set it on the crate. He added a pouch of credit tabs that represented winter heaters and 3 workers' dorms, and a week's fuel for a shuttle no one loved. He hesitated, then unsnapped a rolled canvas of hand tools so tuned to his grip that parting with them felt like dropping a finger into a donation box. He kept the wrench. "Done." "Fool," someone said, with the special contempt the galaxy reserved for human sentimentality. It slid off Kieran like rain. He crouched by the enclosure and clicked the torch he used for field fixes. The cage's welds complained, then yielded. The door swung crooked on a hinge that felt insulted by mercy. He didn't shove it open. He put the torch down, sat back on his heels, and let his hands rest palm up where the dragon could see them. "Guardian 7, he said, trying the number as if it might fit better than a name. "I'm Kieran. I'm going to get you out of here, if that's all right with you." The old head lifted an inch. The eyes cleared, not to brilliance but to an awareness that measured gentleness against experience and found it improbable, which is not the same as impossible. It extended its muzzle a half handspan, scenting the salt and iron of him, the factory heat baked into his coat, the faint electrical tang of a man who'd been around cheap power too long. Its breath touched his knuckles and came back warmer. He did not stroke a noble brow. He slid an arm under a chest that was more bone than furnace and lifted in increments, as if memory itself could be injured by haste. The dragon staggered and leaned into him, betraying a weight its size had hidden. "Easy," he murmured, and the murmuring worked on both of them. They walked through the bazaar under a new silence, a seam of space opening in front of them as traders who had called the creature ugly suddenly found it bad luck to be touched by a story. The collar tags swung and flashed at each step, the engraving catching stray light like an eye opening behind grime. At the dock stairs, Kieran paused and looked back once because the human heart is a fool for witness. No one met his gaze. That was fine. He had the only witness he needed, breathing slow and distrustful at his side. They disappeared into the red fog that rolled off the refinery stacks as evening settled, the market's noise folding back over the absence they left like a bandage that wouldn't stick. The hangar had been dead longer than many planets stayed fashionable. Doors stuck in their rails, the roof boomed when the wind found its loose plates, a skiff skeleton slumped in one corner under a tarp that had given up calling itself weatherproof. Kieran jimmied the lock with the stubborn grace of someone who makes a living persuading corroded things to remember cooperation. Inside, cold air lay like unclaimed property. He made a camp that didn't waste heat. An old heater coughed, remembered its first principles, and glowed. He spread a thermal blanket and coaxed the dragon onto it with a hand held low and another pressed to his own chest in a gesture of shared investment. When the creature settled, its sigh moved dust across the floor in a faint ring. Up close, the collar told more than the tag. The band wasn't just metal. It was metal threaded with something organic, a braid of alloy and forgotten biology. The fastener had been broken and repaired 3 times by hands that didn't love their work. Kieran rolled it gently and found an access seam at the back of the neck, disguised as corrosion. He swore softly at whoever had put a port where a creature could never have used it unassisted, fetched a lamp, and cleaned until the seam responded to light like a pupil. "Guardians," he said to keep the room occupied while he dug. "I read about you, human-made custodians for ships full of sleepers. You watched systems. You watched dreams. You didn't land with them because there wasn't enough fuel to be noble and useful." He pried a final fleck of oxide free, exposing a recessed panel barely the width of his thumb. "But something landed you, or someone." He worked the panel open and blinked at the architecture beneath. It wasn't military blinking lights, it was understated genius. Copper traces grown into the curve of bone, capacitors tucked like seeds along the ridge, insulation that had once been self-healing. Time had stolen the self from healing. Connections flaked where a century of cheap repairs had gnawed. He recognized a converter salvagers on 3 worlds worshipped like a god, and smiled at that, as if finding an old teacher selling fruit in a market. "Okay," he breathed, and sat back on his heels. "We're not firing anything up tonight. You need cleaning, and I need to remember where I put my near micros." He organized the hangar the way he organized a life. 1 table cleared, 1 crate cannibalized, 1 promise made, and then honored. He laid out a coil of wire whose insulation had survived better than his optimism, heat paste, so old it had separated but could be bullied into usefulness, a spool of fiber the color of bad tea. He cut strips of cloth from the hem of his own coat and dampened them, then began to clean. Moss grew in the seam between plates where moisture had found a theme. He teased it away with a patient pick and revealed, beneath the gray, a suggestion of pattern not ornamental but functional. A lattice of alloy laced through scale, an old human idea about how to persuade living tissue to host technology without becoming its servant. He spoke to it as his cloth worked, quiet as if he might startle it back into dormancy. "Look at you." Someone loved this design. Someone was proud. The dragon endured the attention with the reserve of a stoic and the occasional flinch of a veteran who expects pain when hands arrive. Kieran matched each flinch to a pause, letting the body see that not all contact is a prelude to hurt. He ran the cloth down a ridge where old blood had varnished a memory and found, to his disgraceful relief, it wasn't recent. "You're a marvel," he said. "They used you like junk." He slid the collar around to study the tag again, now clean enough to reflect the lamp as a thin bar. Property of Earth's first expedition, Unit Guardian 7. On the reverse, letters had been scratched in by a hand that lacked practice in engraving and made up for it with need. If found, return them. Not return it, them. He swallowed around a throat that hadn't asked for opinion. "They loved someone too," he said to the absent engraver. "We'll do what we can by all of you." Outside, Vrakshin's twin moons hauled themselves over the horizon like tired gods. The city's distant clamor sank, replaced by the slow percussion of refinery pistons and the occasional echo of laughter in a language older than the bazaar. Kieran bandaged the worst cracks with resin warmed between his palms, and pressed into place with a thumb that had tightened bolts and turned pages, and once, briefly, worn a ring. The dragon's eyes slid open to watch him. It wasn't brightness so much as attention. Breath warmed incrementally. When he paused to flex fingers that had silted up with ache, it flicked a tongue like a scrap of silk and tasted the air around his knuckles. He laughed, surprised by the sound, and didn't apologize. "Yes, I'm mostly coffee and bad habits. You'll survive the exposure." He fetched a battered flask and offered the cap as a saucer. The dragon sniffed, snorted, and ignored the water until he dipped a finger and tapped a single drop onto its tongue. The reflex kicked. The throat worked. He waited out the stubbornness and then refilled. "Right. You and every apprentice I ever had," he muttered affectionately, and kept the cap coming until the level in the flask was an honest problem for later. He lowered the lamp and sat with his back to a crate so his spine could remember straight. The dragon shifted, so the arc of its body curved around him without enclosing him, a geometry discovered by accident and held by mutual consent. The heater hummed its small, faithful hum. The hangar roof calmed as the wind forgot to argue. Kieran pulled the tag's chain gently up off the plates to see how it lay. It wasn't tight. It had only felt like a shackle, because no one had bothered to loosen it. He turned the disc on its ring until the engraving faced the room, a moon that had remembered what it was for. "Guardian," he said again, "because names change the way a room holds a body. Rest. Tomorrow I'll find you cells that don't explode when I look at them. We'll see if your voice wants to come home." The dragon exhaled, longer than a sigh, but not yet a decision. Kieran set his hand just behind the tag, not to claim, not to comfort, but to leave something warm where metal had been cold for too long. The contact lasted as long as it needed to, and no longer. When he withdrew it, the heat remained. He slept sitting up, because men who've camped with machines learn that posture from necessity. Sometime in the hour before dawn, the lamp guttered and went dark. The hangar breathed. A faint tremor ran through the plates under his palm, as if an old engine somewhere in the architecture had tried one shy, experimental turn, and then, undecided, waited for morning. By morning, the hangar had learned his pattern. Kieran boiled the last of the water on a heater that wheezed like an old harmonica, swallowed half, poured the rest over his hands, and went back to the seam at the base of the collar. The night's careful cleaning had revealed a crown of dormant ports arranged like a halo. He laid out salvaged cells the way priests once laid out candles, tested each with a muttered apology to whatever gods tolerated improvisation, and chose the least dishonest 3. "Small steps," he told the dragon, "because creatures and machines both prefer a plan said out loud. We wake nothing all at once." He bridged the first cell with a braided lead and brushed the contact to a corroded node. The scale above it trembled, not in pain but in the animal equivalent of a shiver. He counted 6 breaths, the dragon's and then his, and tried the second, then the third, stacking voltage until the copper veins inlaid through the collar picked up a faint, citrine glow. Somewhere inside the architecture, capacitors remembered their purpose and stretched. The tag warmed against his knuckle. The dragon's eye opened with intent. Not brightness, clarity. A muscle along its jaw ticked. From deep in the throat, beneath cartilage and grafted alloy, a distortion lifted and collapsed, the old circuitry clearing its throat. "DN online," the voice said, cracked as a radio in rain. The dragon startled itself, head jerking as if the sound had come from the door. Kieran sank to a squat so that the world stayed level. "That's you," he murmured, ridiculous and entirely correct. "That's yours." Guardian, the voice tried again, choosing a path through static. Unit 7, Verify Operator. Kieran's laugh came out thin and unguarded. Operator Kieran Holt, Earthborn, Engineer, Stubborn. He bent closer to the caller. You have a handshake? Of course you do. Where did you hide it, clever creature? He found it not in the panel, but on the tag itself. The engraving wasn't only letters. Microgrooves ran between strokes like irrigation channels. He pressed his thumb to the words property of Earth's first expedition and felt a faint prickling as it sampled him. Old biotech doing its best with a man built long after its designers had gone to dust. Match. Partial. The dragon's voice said, less broken now, as if hearing a language strokes memory back into ease. Protocol. Default to caretaker class until senior crew return. Senior crew are very late, Kieran said and put his palm, calloused, burned, human, over the tag. Caretaker will have to do. The pupil widened, then narrowed to a precise comma. The breath carried more heat. The old engine under the plates turned over one full, brave time. Primary directive? It asked. He could have said any of 100 things. He could have said survive, or flee, or hide. He looked at the caller's scratched reverse. If found, return them, and bit down on the sudden ache that sentence always carried. Protect human life, he answered, naming the oldest part of the ship's promise. Mine if you must, others if we're lucky. The dragon blinked slowly, reading the air around his words. Acknowledged, it said, soft as a confession, and let its head descend the last inconvenient inch onto his knee. Its weight settled there with an honesty metal never achieves. The glow along the collar brightened a hair. He began the real work. He wicked old flux from solder joints with strips cut from his shirt, burnished oxidized contacts under the lamp until they loved metal again, and bridged a long-dead regulator with a slice of copper scavenged from a beacon no one would miss until it already had. Each connection earned him another word in the dragon's threadbare vocabulary. Engine temperature nominal, wing actuators offline but listening, memory banks fragmented but extant. Memory, Kieran repeated, feeling that word like a key in the old lock of grief. What do you remember? A static hiss, then a thin projection rose unsteadily above the tag, a cheap, dear holography built for emergencies, not spectacle. It showed little more than outlines, a corridor with rounded corners, a row of sleep pods like eggs, a child's shoe kicked under a bench, and forgotten the way children forget the exact things you hope they'll keep. In the center, a figure reached for the projector. Two kids' small hands leaving greasy smudges on the lens, a face ghosted by resolution and years. Guardian, the long-ago child said, voice climbing a little in the way of children trying to get machines to be kind. If we get lost and you wake up alone, you find the next grown-up and you be brave until they tell you not to. The image stuttered, split, and collapsed. The dragon's body tensed the length of its spine and let go. I failed, it said, and managed to make the two words sound like a field report, not a wound. Kieran set the iron aside. He didn't say you didn't. He set his hand behind the collar so his warmth found the place where the tag had bitten for too many years. You kept what you could, he said, and then you waited. That's a kind of bravery nobody sings about. Outside, Vraxian's morning started its tired engines. In the hangar, a draft tugged at the tarp over the skiff skeleton and made it flap a rhythm like a slow heartbeat. The tag's light steadied into a pulse that matched Kieran's thumb. The glow extended in a thin vein along one wing root, then retreated, shy of commitment. Wing actuators offline, the dragon announced again, as if embarrassed to have a body that can't match its will. Then we don't fly, Kieran replied simply. We fortify. He rapped his knuckles on the floor. Company will come sniffing the first time the market hears you have a voice. Threat assessment, high, Guardian 7 agreed, in a tone that didn't try to frighten anyone. Countermeasures? Kieran stood, bones adding up to resolve. You and me, he said, and a hangar full of junk that doesn't know yet it's useful. The dragon's eye followed him as he crossed to a crate labeled refuse. Its lid came free in a squeal he felt in his molars. He turned back, grinning with the light that work puts in a man's face. Let's go teach some old metal new opinions. Above the collar, the faintest curl of steam rose from the dragon's nostrils, warm and patient and real. It watched him coil cable and set out parts, and for the first time since someone had scratched a plea on the back of its tag, Let certainty fill a quiet room. The bazaar learned sooner than he'd hoped. It was not the auctioneer who came. He would have dressed it up in ceremony and fees. But the men who drift to the edge of any market and live by reading the jumps in air pressure before a weather change. Two figures in matte coats paused under the hangar's broken eave at dusk, as if sheltering from nothing. An hour later, a survey drone clicked at the threshold and left, carrying the news that a dead space had a pulse. By full dark, the hangar had a perimeter. Tripwires that weren't wires, but nicked coils of monofilament stolen from fishing rigs. A ring of empty fuel drums perched this close to toppling over, a crane's ancient magnet rewired to a salvaged battery and hung like a fist over what would be, in a few minutes, a good place for someone unfriendly to stand. Kieran's hands had the steadiness of exhaustion. His mind had the lucidity of people who know this hour matters, and the others will be shaped by it. Guardian 7 watched, head on pause, pretending to doze the way veterans do when they agree to delegation. Heat moved lazily along the collar. When Kieran placed a trigger in a shadow under the gantry, the dragon's eye rolled, amused. Clever, it said, and Kieran startled at the casual praise. Being seen had become rare. They heard the skimmer before they saw it, a mosquito whine tuned to the frequency of bad news. It set down 2 blocks away, because people who do this for a living do not stand where walls can collapse on them by accident. Footsteps followed in the slushy grit, a line of them, cautious. Someone laughed. The laugh men used to agree they will pretend what they are about to do is easy. Kieran didn't blow the magnet early. He waited until the line of steps broke in the doorway. The first figure in a matte coat swept a beam across the floor, found the old skiff chassis, saw only junk and a human tired enough to be underestimated. The second figure stepped to a spot Kieran had blasphemed about all afternoon, the exact patch where the gantry's shadow hid the magnet's kiss. Evening, Kieran said, from the crouch of a man apparently resigned to theft. Evening, the first replied, beaming goodwill that didn't reach his hands. We're here about a commodity that wandered from an owner's custody. Paperwork is available. We'll be removing the item now. Kieran held up his empty palms, the way you do when dealing with predators who like form. You brought paperwork to a hangar? He asked, and pressed the trigger with his heel. The magnet thunked. The gantry cable went taut with a noise like a plucked bass string. A section of ceiling panel that had no business moving chose, under persuasion, to have business. It dropped sideways onto the exact section of floor where the second figure's boots waited for orders. It wasn't enough to kill, which mattered to Kieran for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy. It was plenty to inconvenience. The man went to his knees in a swear that had the cadence of 3 different languages. The beam in his hand cut a ribbon of light into the dark and then did nobody any favors. The first raised a weapon strangers refer to as universal and doctors call regrettable. Guardian 7 stood. Everyone's instincts made suggestions. The 2 men said shoot or run. Both are useful, rarely together. Kieran said move closer to the most dangerous thing in the room and tell it something true. He stepped toward the dragon's muzzle as if into a hearth's warmth and set his palm, grease, burns, ridiculous humanity, against the tag. Guardian, he said, and the tag pulsed because it liked being reminded what it was. Caretaker class authorizes defensive posture. The old blue woke in the dragon's pupils, not flood bright, just enough to crown edges. He exhaled and the air went warm enough to turn the hangar's ghosts to breath. Under Kieran's hand the collar's veins brightened. The voice that rose from a throat cobbled from patience and memory carried no bravado. Directive engaged, Guardian 7 said. Protect human life. The first man fired with the panicked precision of amateurs. The bolt slapped the floor where Kieran had been a heartbeat before and charged into the fuel drum ring. Flames leapt, remembered gravity, and sat down where he'd asked them to sit by the judicious placement of sandbags and a line of powdered stone. The fire made drama without progress. The dragon moved, old body writing a bigger idea of space. It did not breathe flame. It put its head in the beam's path, and let the collar drink a gout of heat it converted to the kind that warms rather than wounds. The weapon went to static in a fizz of impotence that delighted Kieran's sense of mechanics. The second man found his feet with the vigor of the recently humiliated, stabbed at his communicator for comfort, and received instead a wall of noise. Kieran's choke device, borrowed from the city's refuse and taught a new dialect. He took one look at the dragon repositioning mass and revised his contract with reality. "We're leaving," he announced, voice too loud, the way people do when narration might rewrite the outcome. "Good plan," Kieran said, because dignity costs him nothing when other currencies are in play. They backed out the way foxes do when leaving a henhouse they haven't robbed. The skimmer's whine rose and turned into a receding insult. The drums ticked as they cooled. A shard of ceiling panel teetered and fell with a clatter that startled no one. Kieran let breath happen. When he put his hand on the tag again, it wasn't to command. It was gratitude learned the hard way. Guardian 7 rolled an eye toward him, edges of the lid soft with something that made Kieran think of footage of dogs understanding jokes. "They will return," the dragon observed, "not as threat, but as logistics. They always do," Kieran said. "But they'll tell worse stories about us when they do, and sometimes that's a deterrent." Firelight flattering what the city's lights had been too cruel to notice, the hangar looked almost holy. Kieran picked up the magnet's cable and tied it off as if securing a ship to a dock that might drift, then sank down against the dragon's chest where the plates were warmer and the textures kinder. He felt more than heard the old engine turn again, a slow, patient crank that had nothing to prove. "You were not built for this," Guardian 7 said after a while, voice stripped of metallic pretense by long use, "for fighting in markets, for hiding in dead places." "Me?" Kieran asked. "Or you?" "Either," the dragon decided, which earned it his crooked grin. "No," he agreed. "We were built to keep people safe." He tipped his head toward the city and its neon fatigue. "Sometimes that looks like what we did tonight. Sometimes it looks like getting through one more morning without making a mistake we can't fix." The dragon's breath warmed the top of his head. Outside, the bazaar remembered its contempt, then its caution, then, somewhere far off, its curiosity. Inside, an old caller wrote a pulse up into an older machine and asked it to believe in a duty borrowed from a vanished ship. Kieran shut his eyes because he could, because for the first time and longer than he would say out loud, the night felt like an ally instead of an opponent keeping score. Beneath his ear, the Guardian's engine and his own heart practiced the basic duet of living things, steady, then steadier, and did not ask for applause. By dawn, the hangar felt lighter, as if the night had shifted some invisible weight and set it down carefully in a corner. Kieran woke with his cheek against warm plate and a list of tasks waiting in his bones. He tuned the choke, rewound a coil that had slept badly, and laid 3 scavenged cells in a cradle he'd hammered out of skiff ribs. Guardian 7 watched through half-lidded eyes, the tag on his collar ticking faintly with the slow pulse of restored circuitry. "They'll come back with a bigger story," Kieran said. "We need a taller place to answer from." "The comm spire," the dragon replied, glancing toward the skyline where a broken tooth of tower bit the morning. "Line of sight to human relay if the air behaves." "Half the city between us and it," Kieran said, and strapped the cells to a harness he'd stitched from webbing and good intentions. "We walk." They did, not sneaking, not skulking. A man and a dwarf dragon stepped into Vrakshin Prime's arterial streets at first light and moved as if they belonged. Vendors were still hauling shutters, the air split on the bias by thin cooking smoke and the rind sour breath of refinery stacks. Faces paused above crates and cups as they passed, the boys who had thrown pebbles, the trader with the stained coat, the purple emissary with silk that reflected nothing as if refusing to participate in dawn. Eyes narrowed, hands hovered over comms. The first whisper rose before the second footfall. "There's the relic." And then, under it, softer. "The caller speaks earth." Half a block down, 3 matte coats stepped from an alley like teeth. "Stop," the foremost said, voice smooth with the confidence of paperwork that isn't present. "Violation notices." "Read the tag," Kieran said, not slowing. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He said it as if reading was contagious. The matte coats did not obey, but a child did. A girl with a tattoo, like a broken circle at her wrist. She ran alongside the dragon for 2 steps and squinted up at the swinging disc. "First expedition," she breathed, loud enough for the street to take up the words. "Guardian." The market is a machine that runs on information and gossip. Sometimes they are the same. Ahead, shutters stuttered and halted. A butcher put down her cleaver. A dockman leaned his entire life onto his cart handle and pushed it into the street until it became a wall. The purple emissary drifted into the gap with the blank look of those who witness and decide later what they felt. Space opened and closed in front of Kieran like a throat swallowing, then refusing to choke. The mat coats touched their weapons and remembered they had not brought enough men. Kieran met the first one's eyes and offered a small, unhelpful smile that meant "I see you and I don't have time." "Paperwork later," he said. "History now." They moved. The city moved with them because people like to be near a moment when it realizes it is becoming a story. At the corner where banners sagged and the awning that had always dripped on schedule, two more hard men shouldered into their path. Kieran lifted his hand toward the tag, and Guardian lifted his head. The collar brightened by a measure no instrument could track, and the dragon spoke in a voice the street understood, because all languages recognize certain sentences when they are spoken by breath that means them. Primary directive: protect human life. That was all. No roar. No heat. The sentence moved through bodies like a temperature change. A woman with 3 pierces along her ear unclenched her jaw. A boy who had learned to spook the old dragon stepped backward twice without knowing he was moving. The hard men found themselves framed by people who were not enemies, not friends, but witnesses with opinions. It is difficult to draw in that arrangement without drawing fire from a different physics. They reached the plaza below the comm spire at noon. It was a sullen tower, cables like tendons stripped and exposed, a metal throat that had not sung properly in a decade. Kieran stumped to its base, squinted up through glare, and made peace with the fact that his shoulder would tell him a new story about pain if he put it to climbing. "You stay ground," he told the dragon, adjusting the harness with its box of cells and the scatter lens strapped to his back with more hope than parts. "If they rush, breathe warm, not hot. We're not melting anyone unless they insist on it." "Understood," Guardian said, and lowered his head so Kieran could rest a palm on the tag for luck. He climbed. The tower remembered its rust the way old men remember grudges. Twice he thought the rung would break, and his weight would negotiate a different arrangement with the ground. Twice it held because metal that has lived this long prefers consistency. At the first platform, he bolted the scatter lens into a frame that had once held an advertisement for a beverage that tasted like sweet chalk. At the second, he veined the choke through a relay box he'd bullied into acting like an amplifier. At the top, he leaned his forehead against the cold and let the city rotate under him until breath agreed to return. "Guardian," he said into his throat mic. "Ready?" "Always," the dragon answered, and somewhere far below the collar ticked once. He unslung the cells, cabled them in parallel, and took a breath. "Expedition 7, if you're out there, your child left a message and he's been very patient." He pressed his thumb to the tag he'd hung at the top from a borrowed chain, the microgroove sipping skin like a small machine remembering how to bless. He spoke the words carved there, because sometimes door codes are simply the names carved on them, waiting to be said with the right heat. "Property of Earth's first expedition, Unit Guardian 7. The choke hummed. The scatter lens fielded the tower's exhale and combed it straight. The air cleared around the spire like a throat before a note. Kieran flicked the final switch and the signal jumped, not with fireworks, not with drama, just with the clean, indecent relief of something doing the job it was built to do. Down below, men in matte coats, promoted by panic to commanders of nothing, lunged. The street did not break, it wove. The butcher's cart rolled. The dockman planted his feet where even gravity had to ask permission. The purple emissary raised both hands and said in a language meant to be useful, "This creature protects humans. This human protects it. Do not annoy mathematics." A shot went wild and punched the tower's flank. Kieran flinched and held the chain anyway. He felt the collar warm under his fingers through metal and distance. Guardian lifted his head and exhaled a breath that turned a sheet of bad intent into a curl of steam. The hard men remembered other appointments and left with the posture of those who will be back or will learn how not to be. The signal tore off across the sky and went looking for anyone who still remembered the handshake of a ship that had gone out before most of this city learned to stand. Kieran closed his eyes and imagined it racing into the high blue, into the quiet lanes between stations, into the first patient ear that would hear, translate, and sit up straight at the name. Only one job remained. It was the strangest one. He had to open his hand, let go of the chain, and climb back down to whatever would arrive. He did, and the last thing he saw before the street swallowed him was the tag at the tower crown catching sun and flaring once, as if winking at him to say the doorbell had been heard. They did not arrive like heroes in a film. They came as a contrail that learned modesty, a black speck that unfolded into a shuttle with the stance of something that would rather not be noticed. It exhaled dust onto the plaza and settled on legs that pretended they hadn't been polished. When its hatch sighed, the air tasted of antiseptic and old coffee, and the kind of order that keeps children breathing in bad winters. The first one down the ramp was a woman with hair she had cut herself and a face that had stolen sleep from other people's nights. She wore the crest of the Terran Relay Corps on her shoulder, a star with too many points and a circle that knew it, and on a lanyard at her neck, a key with the vanity of never having met a lock it admired. She took in the dragon, the man, the street, the tower with its borrowed tag, and did a quick math that ended with her eyes stinging. "Kieran Holt," she said, "you sent a handshake on a frequency that hasn't forgiven anyone since before my grandmother was born." He nodded, suddenly young and awkward under the remnant armature of his life. "Your relays remember old friends? They remember debts," she said, and stepped down onto Vraxian's hospitality. "Where is the tag?" He touched his sternum and then laughed, because habits are ridiculous. He pointed up. "At the crown. But this one." He tapped the disc on Guardian's collar. "Has more to say." He pressed his thumb to the engraving because ceremony had earned its place here. The dragon lifted his head, and the voice that came wasn't loud or theatrical. It was the tone good machines use to report success without bragging. "Unit Guardian 7, he said. "Protective custody maintained. Primary directive affirmed. Awaiting reassignment." The relay woman's jaw did something unprofessional. She stepped close enough to despair of her predecessors, close enough to admire the engineering that had carried courage through centuries of neglect. She read the tag aloud in the official way and then flipped it with a finger gentler than she had. "If found, return them," she said, voice gone smaller, as if a corridor had narrowed around the words. "We tried. We didn't know where to look." Kieran swallowed and found a laugh he hadn't had the right to in years. He knew where to wait. The plaza was an amphitheater that hadn't asked for tickets, but would be damned if it missed the show. The butcher stood behind her cart and cried quietly into her apron. The dockman leaned on his handle as if it were a mast, and his ship had finally come to harbor. The purple emissary wiped at one eye as if dust had been badly timed and said to no one, "It seems humans remain contagious." The relay woman looked at Guardian and then at Kieran. "We can tow him," she said. "We can bring him to a ship with a lab and do the right refurbish, not this." She sweated a smile toward the harness and webbing. "Miracle. We can put him somewhere quiet and let him sleep where history will behave." Kieran put his hand on a plate where warmth had gathered and didn't look away from the dragon. "What do you want?" he asked, because men who fix things know that preference is a tool. Guardian 7 turned his head so the city could see the seam where plate became skin under his jaw, the vulnerable place, and set it gently against Kieran's shoulder for exactly as long as it took to answer the question. He lifted it again and looked at the woman with the key. "Caretaker," he said. "Reassignment requested." She closed her eyes and opened them. "Done," she said, because sometimes authority is remembering where it comes from. She unhooked her lanyard and reached up. Kieran took a step forward without realizing it. Between them, they slid the key onto the tag's ring, a ridiculous adornment that meant nothing to the circuitry and everything to the people watching. It caught the sun and hung there, Earth's permission wearing itself where a plea had endured. There were still forms. There were still implications and purchases and the simple, stubborn fact that the bazaar needed its head count and could not eat gratitude. The relay woman turned to the crowd and made an offer in the music of trade. Repair vouchers, fuel stipends, rangers on contract to walk this market for a season like gossip in armor. The butcher wiped her face and said, "We will accept if you write it down where we can read it." The woman smiled like a person happy to be dictated to by decency. She called down a clerk who had wanted to be a poet and handed him a tablet and a stylus he pretended not to treasure. Kieran climbed the spire one last time to fetch the tag that had reached up and pulled the sky down. He pocketed it without fanfare because spectacle had had its turn. On the way down, he thought about homes he had almost made in little rooms, and homes he had made for machines in large ones, and realized he had been training for this absurdity all his life. They walked to the shuttle through a lane of quiet bodies that leaned in to be part of a future without needing credit. Children reached to touch warm scale and withdrew their hands, as if from a stove that had remembered kindness. The dragon stooped without shame to let the smallest scratch where a plate ended and the world began. The purple emissary stepped forward with a ribbon of silk and, with a bow that had the dignity of a sign written through wind, tied it to the ring beside the key. "For luck," they said, and did not charge for it. At the ramp, Kieran turned because men who have been alone too long are allowed this one indulgence. He raised his wrench in a salute that had been a joke when he was young, and was not now. The dockman lifted his cart handle in return. The butcher kissed 2 fingers and pressed them to the air. The clerk held up the tablet like a promise notarized by sunlight. Inside, the shuttle smelled like every machine room he had loved more than was recommended. The relay woman strapped him in as if she had been assigned this man years ago and had only just caught up. Guardian 7 folded himself into the cargo bay and laid his head near Kieran's shoulder so the tag could touch human heat when the engines spooled. When the skids lifted, Fraction looked briefly beautiful, the way rot sometimes does when the light decides to be kind. The city receded. The spire shrank. The plaza became a drawing scribbled by an apprentice who will one day carve. The relay woman glanced over her shoulder from the cockpit. Course? Kieran looked at the dragon, at the tag, at the key, at the silk that had no function and all the meaning, and said, "Where you keep the names that would have been lost." "Copy," she said, and the shuttle turned on a vector that pointed toward a station where archivists pressed sorrow into hard drives and called it duty. Guardian 7 closed his eyes and let the engines hum braid with his own. "Directive fulfilled," he said, too quietly for the console to pick up, just loud enough to reach the only ear that mattered. "Protect human life." Kieran rested his palm against the tag so the microgrooves could memorize the shape of a man who had read them out loud in a market that didn't believe in miracles. The disc warmed under his hand. The hangar, the bazaar, the rust, the insults, the quiet assists from strangers who had taught their hands to be useful, all of it tucked itself into the space between his ribs and settled. The first star of the relay winked on as if someone had flipped a switch in a room with better wiring. The shuttle leaned into its path. The dragon's breath slowed. The man's did too. Somewhere in the dark ahead, a ledger no one had updated in 300 years waited for a curve to be etched beside an old line and for a new word to be written after it. Kept